Welcome back to Introduction to Microeconomics. I'm Keith Kucha. In this video, we're carrying on with supply and demand. We're going to take a look at this notion of comparative statics, surplus, and efficiency. This really is the second video in this series that follows up on the first one that looked at where supply comes from, where demand comes from, the determinants of each of those supply and demand equations, as well as introduced the notion of equilibrium, and importantly, how we got to an equilibrium from a disequilibrium situation. So if you haven't watched that video already, I recommend watching that one first, and then we'll launch into this one. So let's go jump over. Let's take a look at this notion. We're going to start with surplus and efficiency, and then we're going to wrap up by taking a look at comparative statics, the complete opposite way that I've written it here in the title. So let's go take a look at that to get started. Okay, so we have before us a expression, a functional form for a supply curve, a functional form for a demand curve. As our quick refresher to start us off, what we want to do is take this, figure out how do we graph it, and then from there, how do we solve for what the initial equilibrium is for this good or service that we have a competitive equilibrium for. And keep in mind, if we are evaluating this with supply and demand, we need to be looking at firms which are price takers. That is, we have to have on the demand side lots of small buyers such that we're aggregating up all of those individuals giving us our demand. We have to have on the supply side lots of small sellers that are all selling a homogeneous good. That is, from the view of us, an apple is an apple. It looks the same, doesn't matter who produces it. So we have lots of apple producers. We don't see a difference between the different apples. So we just have all of those individual producers' marginal costs added up, giving us our industry marginal cost or our industry supply. If these assumptions are met, we can use this supply and demand diagram. Hopefully you catch that those assumptions are rarely met in reality, but let's go take a look and see how we could solve for equilibrium. So to start off, let's go and just visualize. Let's use the right tool. Let's start off with our axes. We have our vertical, we have our horizontal. Our vertical is our unit of account, typically dollars. Our horizontal is our number of units altogether, our quantity. Starting off with our demand equation. In this case, our demand equation is the top one. I know because it has a negative slope. I would want to start off with the vertical intercept. That is a vertical intercept of 15. From that vertical intercept, I am decreasing at a rate of -3. That is, every extra Q that I add, my price drops by 3. So Q becomes 1, price becomes 12. Q becomes 2, price becomes 9. Carrying that on all the way down, and I get my demand. Keep in mind, the way that we've written it is actually more of a maximum willingness to pay, or the way that we'll probably be looking at it most here, our marginal benefit. That is really the way that it's been portrayed. And if that's 15, we can always get the horizontal intercept by saying 15 divided by the magnitude of our slope. So 15 divided by 3 would give me a horizontal intercept of 5. Again, maybe it's helpful to think of this all together in terms of thousands of units, because we have lots of small buyers all wanting to buy this, and 5 isn't really conducive to that assumption. So maybe we're talking about thousands in this case. Moving on to our supply, similarly starting off with our vertical intercept of 5. Well, if that's 15, just to ballpark it, something like that would be around 5. And we have our positive slope of 2, so we are increasing, and that gives us something like that, such that this is our supply. Again, keep in mind, the way that we've expressed it is actually more of our minimum willingness to accept, or the way that we can potentially look at it, our marginal cost. Okay, from here, one of the first things we want to do is solve for our equilibrium. What is going to be that market clearing price? And similarly, what is our quantity exchanged at that market clearing price? So to do so, all we have to do is set these two equations equal to one another. So we'll have 15 minus 3q equal to 5 plus 2q. We have q common to both sides. We want to consolidate those q's together. Once those q's are consolidated together, we want to isolate them. So I don't like dealing with negatives, so I'm going to add 3q to both sides. And we have 15 equals 5 plus 2q plus that 3q gives us 5q. Now that our q's are consolidated, we want to isolate them. So let's move this 5 to the other side. So minus 5 from both sides, and we have 10 equals 5q. Continuing to isolate, divide both sides by 5 to get q by itself. So 10 divided by 5 gives us 2 equals q. So there we go. All together, our quantity exchanged is 2. And again, if we think about that as 1,000, that'd be 2,000 units is what's being bought and sold. To find our market clearing price, we'd want to take this quantity exchanged and substitute it back into either equation. It shouldn't matter which one we use. To do both, just to confirm we got that as the right number, 15 minus 3 times 2. So that would be 15 minus 3 times 2. 3 times 2 is 6. So 15 minus 6 would give me a price of 9. Again, to make sure that's right, we would have 5 plus 2 times 2. 2 times 2 is 4. 4 plus 5 is also 9. There we go. That's looking pretty good. Those are the same number. So we get our market clearing price of 9. At this market clearing price of 9, we get our quantity exchanged of 2. Great. From here, let me just quickly clean up the board, and then let's talk about what we want to look at for this video, which is surplus. So as we go through this, what we are wanting to take a look at is the surplus or the benefit that accrues to both the consumer and the producer as they go through this process, this transaction, as they engage in trade with each other. That is, if we start off by taking a look at the consumer, the demand side, what we see is that, well, the consumer, well, let's just go and actually work through this. For the first, well, I guess that'd be the 1,000 product. So if we were to set Q to 1, well, okay, if we look at our demand, 15 minus 3 times 1, so 15 minus 3, that gives us 12. For this first unit, per 1,000 units, the consumer was willing to pay $12. However, the market clearing price is only $9. So that is, the consumer got a benefit, a net benefit from buying this at the market clearing price of $3 per unit, the difference between that 12 and that 9. At each point along this curve, we could take a look at each of those thousands of individual units. And what we see is that at each point, there is what they were willing to pay versus the price they have to pay. What they were willing to pay versus the price they have to pay. Willing, what they have to, willing, what they have to, all the way down and through here, such that if we were to just keep doing that for every possible tiny amount of Q that could be bought or sold, all the way until what they were willing to pay was exactly that market clearing price they have to pay, we would get all of the surplus, all of the benefit that accrues to the consumer through the fact that they got to pay less for those first 2,000 units than they were willing to. And that is surplus. That is total, I shouldn't say total, that is net benefit to the consumer altogether. We can find this area. Let's maybe just draw this a little bit differently. Let's see if I can do this here. There we go. We would get this area of this triangle as our total consumer surplus. That is, again, the difference between what they were willing to pay and had to pay up to the quantities exchanged. So because they were willing to pay more than they have to pay, they're getting surplus, they're getting benefit. Altogether, what is this? Like I said, it's just the area of a triangle. How do we find the area of a triangle? Well, area of a triangle is just equal to 1/2 base times height. What do we have in this case here? Well, 1/2 base. We have a base of 2 of our triangle. So 1/2 times 2 times what's our height? Well, we have a height of 15 down to 9. So that's a height of 6. 1/2, 2 times 6. So, hey, look, and that cancel. We are left with a consumer surplus of $6 in this case. This is the consumer's gains from trade, the benefits that they get altogether by engaging in trade, by buying this good, rather than going through the whole process of just making it themselves or going without. We could similarly work this out for the producer. If we were to take a look at the producer side, and let's use red for that, the producer has their willingness to accept the lowest price that they would accept to produce goods up till the actual market clearing price. Although they're willing to accept these low prices, they get to sell each of them at $9. So similarly, the producer is making surplus. That is, the producer is making $9 off of what they were willing to sell for much, much less. And again, we can find this whole area as that triangle, the difference between their willingness to accept and the price they do accept up until the quantity exchanged. And what we see is that, again, it's just another triangle. So this is just, again, our producer surplus would be 1/2 base times height. So that's 1/2. We again have the same base of 2 times a height of 5 to 9. So that's a height of 4. In our scenario, again, that 1/2 and that 2 cancel each other out. And we get our producer surplus. This is the gains that the producers get from trade. And that is they get a gains from trade of $4. This is what they get, the benefit that they receive by being able to sell their good for $9 a unit instead of what they were willing to accept for each unit up till that final unit where the willingness to accept is equal to the price. What we can do then is we can take a look at the total surplus that is received altogether. And this total surplus that is received altogether is what we would refer to as our social surplus. And the social surplus is quite simply the consumer plus the producer surplus. Presuming that these are the only two economic agents that are involved, sometimes we'll introduce a third economic agent, our government. But right now, we only have consumers and producers taking place in this market. So our social surplus is the consumer plus the producer surplus. That is 6 plus 4. We are getting social surplus of $10 altogether. This is society's altogether gain from trade by engaging in this market situation. The difference between what we were willing to pay and our willingness to accept all the way up until the quantities we actually exchange. And because we have this distinction, this differentiation, between our willingness to pay and our willingness to accept. Each of us gets gains. Each of us win by coming together to trade, and society wins altogether. In this case, we can evaluate the values of each of those. One of the neat things, and this is where we get into a term we'd call allocative efficiency, is that surplus is maximized at the equilibrium. And we can see this. We can go through and we can work out why and how surplus is maximized at the equilibrium. And really, to see this, let's just go through a very quick, very brief example of a situation where we are either producing, so Q is either higher or lower than this equilibrium quantity exchanged. And let's start off with the lower case, where we are artificially producing less than this equilibrium quantity exchanged. Let's just clean up and take a look at that. So having redone this, we've shown our original equilibrium. Consumers, we're getting a surplus of 6. Producers, a surplus of 4. Society, a surplus of 10. If we were to, let's just change the color here to kind of a peach. If we were to hold quantities artificially low, so at a low Q, and at this low Q, that's going to be this low quantity of 1, we'd want to figure out what is our new consumer surplus, what is our new producer surplus, and what is our new social surplus to see if we're better off or worse off. And what I want you to see here is that while we're sure that the new quantity is 1, there is some ambiguity as to what the price might be. Now, where do these prices come from? Well, what I did is I put in a value of 1 for the demand function. So 15 minus 3 gives us 12, or 1 into our supply equation, 5 plus 2 is 7. So just throwing in this quantity into each of our equations to get either our maximum willingness to pay or our minimum willingness to accept. I say there's some ambiguity about the prices because if the supplier was able to have more market power, they would want to push the price closer to what the highest price people would pay would be. Meanwhile, if the purchasers had more power, they would want to push the price down closer to what the minimum willingness to accept is. Depending on who has that relative power will result on where we end up. That will then influence the consumer or producer surplus. But from our perspective, that's okay because I'm not interested in evaluating the consumer and producer surplus. The big goal here in taking a look at the efficiency of this market is to take a look at how the social surplus changes. And so what we're going to presume is, because it's typically the case we witness, the supplier has the market power. So the supplier is able to push that price up to $12 a unit when we are selling 1,000 units. So the supplier has the market power, pushing the price up to the maximum willingness to pay. Working through this, then, we can work out the consumer surplus, the difference between what we are willing to pay and that price we have to pay. We get that triangle there. To bring it forward, let's use blue for our consumer surplus. We get a triangle like that. And all that is just a triangle. So we can go 1/2 base. What's our base? Only a base of 1. Times height, we have 15 minus 12 is 3. So 1/2 of 3 gives us 1.5 as our consumer surplus. We see consumers have significantly lost. What about the producers? How are the producers doing in this case? Well, the difference between the price we have to accept, so we're accepting a price of $12, and the price we're willing to accept. So, there's quite a big gap there between what we're willing to accept and what we have to accept. In this case, we get 2 shapes. We get, and let's use red for this, for the producer. we get this bit here, which is a triangle. This I'll call consumer surplus 1. And then we also get, we'll use the box tool, this area here, and we'll call that consumer surplus. I'm sorry, I was calling it consumer. Sloppy. Triangle, producer surplus 1, box, producer surplus 2. And again, altogether, that's the difference between the price that we have to accept of $12 and the price we're willing to accept along our supply curve. All we have to do is find out the geometric areas of the box and the triangle, and those together will give us our producer surplus. So let's start with the box because that's mathematically easy. That's just base times height. We have a base of 1. We have a height of 12 minus 7. So that's a height of 5. So altogether, 1 times 5 gives us 5. Plus, what's this triangle going to be? That's going to be 1/2 of our base. Our base is 1. And then height, what's our height? Our height is 2. Okay, those 2's cancel. All we're left with is an area there of 1. So 5 plus 1 equals 6. So we see that all together, hey, our producers are better off. They've gained $2 worth of surplus, going from 4 to 6. However, our consumers are significantly worse off, losing about $4.5 of surplus. What is society's surplus altogether? Well, that's going to be the consumers plus the producers. So altogether, that is $7.5 of social surplus. We see that society clearly has lost. That loss to society, we call that loss to society the dead weight loss. Again, DWL, dead weight loss. That is the 10 we would have received at equilibrium minus where we end up. So that is our dead weight loss is $2.5 in this case. Surplus that we could have received, but we've left on the table because we did not produce at equilibrium. Where does this dead weight loss show up in our diagram? Let's use a different color to see it. Let's use yellow. Our dead weight loss is this consumer surplus that we've given up, this producer surplus we've given up. So that is altogether this triangle here, this shaded in triangle right here, that is our dead weight loss. And again, we can find this area by taking a look at the geometric area and confirming that it equals 2.5. It's just a triangle. So we would have 1/2, and we have a base of 1, and we have a height of 12 minus 7, that is 5. So 1/2 of 5 is 2.5. Would you look at that? Those are equal. Thus, we have done all of our work correct. And we've said, hey, look at that. By holding our Q artificially low, our surplus is low. Thus, we are not at the most efficient outcome. We are leaving a bunch of money on the table, a bunch of benefit on the table that we could have otherwise received. Sure, our producers are happy with this outcome. They're much better off, but our consumers are significantly worse off, such that society on whole loses by that size of our deadweight loss. So that's the case where if we aren't producing enough, we're producing at some Q below equilibrium. But what if we had the opposite case? What if we had a case where we are producing at a Q above equilibrium? Maybe we can be better off in that scenario. Well, again, let's go take a look and evaluate our surplus underneath a high production level. Okay, in this scenario, we're taking a look at a high Q such that we are producing, and at this point of a Q of 3 or 3,000, based off this Q of 3, we have our willingness to pay we'd be willing to pay $6, and we have a willingness to accept of $11. In this scenario, again, when we have this discrepancy, it's some ambiguity as to what the actual price is. Let's again say that our market price is based off of the willingness to pay, because again, demand often forms our feasibility set. So let's just lean on that and say 6 becomes our new price. Based off of this, then we want to work through, well, what is at this high quantity, what is our consumer surplus, what is our producer surplus, and what is our social surplus? Maybe we can be better off if we produce more stuff. Well, let's start off with that consumer surplus. Again, difference between what we are willing to pay and the price we have to pay. So pretty big area there altogether. Well, let's go and take that. We'll use blue for the consumer. And we get that triangle. Let's just make that a little bit transparent. Oh, let's move it back where it's supposed to be. There we go. Let's make that a little bit transparent so that we can see the stuff behind it. Okay. So altogether, this is our consumer surplus, which is just a triangle. 1/2 base, what's our base? 3 times a height. We have a height of 15 down to 6, so we have a height of 9. Result of that then, so 1/2 base times height gives us altogether a consumer surplus of, let's just write it over here, 13.5. Wow, would you look at that? Consumers are already getting a surplus greater than the social surplus. This looks like this is going to be a pretty big win altogether for them. Okay, but then what's on the flip side? The flip side is that at this quantity, producers are producing all the way up to 3. And so in this case here, they have what their willingness to accept is. They have what their willingness to accept is, but then they have this price that they do accept. And so what we get is we get this weird bit where they are getting, let's use red for the producer. They're getting this bit here. Let's make that a little bit more poppy so we can see it. There we go. They're getting that little bit there. But then we have this whole area. Ooh, let's maybe try that a different way. They're getting this whole area here as sort of, if we want to take a look at this, a negative producer surplus, such that they have their willingness to accept, but they have the price that they are accepting. So 2 triangles altogether in this case. We have their normal positive producer surplus, and in this case here, it's just a triangle. So we would need to know what is that value. And we can find that quite easily by just going, okay, at a price of 6, into our supply equation, what is going to be the corresponding quantity? So at 6, that is equal to 5 plus 2q. Let's isolate that q, so minus 5 from each side. 1 equals 2q. Get that q alone, divide both sides by 2, we get 1/2 equals q. So that is a level of output of 0.5 units. So producer surplus, 1/2 times our base is 0.5. Our height is 5 to 6, that's a height of 1. So 1/2 of 0.5 That is 0.25 is our producer surplus, the positive side of the producer surplus. They then have this aspect. Again, it's just a triangle, so we have 1/2. What's our base? 0.5 to 3. So we have a base of 2.5, and we have a height from 11 to 6. So that is 5. What does that work out to? Well, that would be 1/2 times 2.5 times 5. That's going to be negative 6.25. So producers altogether, what are they getting? 0.25 minus 6.25. Producers are altogether losing $6 worth of surplus. Result of this altogether then is we get our consumers getting 13.5, producers losing 6, and we get a social surplus of $7.5. Hey, that's just coincidence. That's just coincidence. Don't take anything from that otherwise. Okay, again though, with respect to our equilibrium, we see that we get a dead weight loss such that our total social surplus is less than what we could have had at equilibrium, such that we have a dead weight loss again of $2.5. And where does this $2.5 show up in this scenario? Well, in this scenario, this shows up as, if we take a look at all of this, well, this is all the consumer surplus. Initially, this negative part of the producer surplus cancels out some of that positive consumer surplus. So this whole bit is just getting canceled out altogether. It becomes 0. This little bit, this is positive. So consumers get towards their social, this blue part. Producers get towards their social, this red part. But then we have left over, let's use kind of this orange. Let's see if this works. We have this leftover triangle here that is just negative. This leftover triangle here is just a negative that is faced by society from us producing more than really the cost is, right? We're getting less benefit than cost at this point. And this triangle, this would work out to be our dead weight loss of 2.5. And again, we could work it out. It's just a triangle. That's 1/2. We would have a base of 1, and we would have a height of 11 to 6. That is a height of 5. So 1/2 base times height gives us a dead weight loss of 2.5. What we see is yet again, by deviating from that competitive equilibrium, we incur a dead weight loss. Thus, we are giving up surplus, we're giving up gains from trade. There is nowhere that is going to make us as well off as society as when we are at the equilibrium. Thus, what we say is when we are at the equilibrium, we are allocatively efficient. This is the highest level of social surplus that we could possibly obtain. As we deviate from it, yes, one could be better off. One could be better off, but not without the expense of another. So that is, our equilibrium is Pareto efficient. Any deviation from the equilibrium might make one party better off, but it's always at the expense of the other. It's always at the expense of the other, such that it is not a Pareto improvement. It is just altogether a loss. So we are Pareto dominant at the equilibrium altogether. Thus, this is our allocatively efficient point. From an efficiency viewpoint, the equilibrium is where we want to be. This is where we are properly allocating resources. We are using the scarce resources of our planet in the most effective way possible. And that's the big idea with surplus here. Let's take a look at a few scenarios. Let's take a look at market power. So if we deviate from this competitive equilibrium, if we introduce market power, where do we end up now? And what is that difference versus our competitive equilibrium case? Well, let's go jump over and have a look. Right, so what we've been implicitly looking at so far when we've been taking a look at the competitive equilibrium with supply and demand is this fundamental assumption that the market we're talking about, whether this be hot dogs or apples or crackers, cookies, I don't know, anything such that as the consumer, you see zero differentiation in the product. You're like, I am not willing to pay a penny more from it from one producer than from another. I view them all as exactly the same. The result is that we had that price taker on the firm side, and we kind of had this recursive situation such that this market supply curve came from, well, for different prices, price equals marginal revenue to marginal cost, giving us our Q star. We then had n number of firms. Let's say we had 1,000 firms. So if all 1,000 firms were making one unit at this P marginal revenue equals marginal cost, then our total market quantity exchanged at that price would be 1,000, one from each of these firms. Okay, that was the basic idea. If this is the case and we have all of these firms competing against each other and doing this, well, then we get our consumer surplus, our producer surplus, and all together we're allocatively efficient. We're at that equilibrium. We're Pareto efficient. We're Pareto optimal. This is the best that we can do given our current costs and given our current preferences that shape our demand curve. So given the constraints of supply and demand, we have the highest gains from trade that we could possibly gain. But what if we didn't have this situation? What if we had product differentiation such that, what if price did not equal marginal revenue? What if instead of this being the market for apples, such that you saw all apples as identical, we then went and took a look at the market for I don't know, a computer, and this is now Apple Computer. And now if we're talking about Apple computers, right, your iThingies, well, in this case, this demand is not just the demand for computers, because you see Apple computers different than LG computers, different than Acer, different than all the other different computer brands out there. So as a result, this would be strictly just the demand for Apple computers, which is differentiated from all the other computers. The similar result is this would no longer be the supply, as in the total market supply of each firm producing one unit, 1,000 firms producing one unit, giving us 1,000 altogether. No, 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 no. If this is now a differentiated good, there's no longer that link between those two. This is now just the marginal cost of production for, well, in this case here, if we're talking about Apple computers, this would be the marginal cost for Apple for their, I don't know, let's say their iMac. There we go, some iThing. That's their marginal cost. Now, instead of P and Q, what do we have? Well, we're no longer at this P and Q equilibrium. What ends up happening is the firm actually witnesses the full demand for its product and says, hey, this is my feasibility set. I can now choose. I'm no longer a price taker. I can now choose my price, witnessing that as I choose a price, I end up choosing a quantity. So as we go and do that, what ends up happening? We get let's just change the color here, downward sloping marginal revenue curve, such that that marginal revenue curve is twice as steep as the demand. So whatever the slope of that demand equation is, the marginal revenue curve is twice as steep. What is the firm doing now? Well, the firm is profit maximizing, so they're going to set their Q star. Let's just keep this blue color going. They're going to set their optimal quantity now at this. Let's try that again. At this Q star. And as they set their quantity at that Q star, what price are they going to charge? Well, they're going to charge the highest price that suckers are willing to pay. That is, they're going to go and look at their feasibility set and say, what is the price I can charge for that Q star? And we get the corresponding P. And I'll call that P1 because that's our new price that now that we're no longer in a competitive equilibrium. What I want you to see is that although we've just overlaid this with our whole product differentiation, so we have the feasibility set, marginal revenue twice as steep, based off of that, maximizing our profits where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. We don't have our cost curves in here, but that's okay. What I want you to see is that the impact this has on surplus is one and the same as what we just worked through, which was we had our initial surplus, and then we had a situation where we artificially held quantities low. And when we artificially held quantities low, the impact of surplus was surplus decrease. We can see this here just the same. We initially had, let me use blue for our consumer surplus. At the initial equilibrium, we had that. Let's go like this. Let's go like that. Let's go like that. Okay, sorry, wrong one. Let's try that again, like that. Okay. Maybe let's make that a little bit shaded. There we go. So there was our initial consumer surplus, everything below our willingness to pay, above the price we had to pay. Then, similarly, let's just change the color to red, because I've been using red for the producer, rather. We have that the producer surplus was that area. So everything below the price that they get to charge at equilibrium, above their willingness to accept. But now we have this new scenario. We have this new scenario where the firm is able to exercise some market power. They actually get to differentiate their goods, so they have their own distinct differentiated demand curve from the market demand curve. You could think about this again as the difference between the market for burgers, where this is now the market for Big Macs. McDonald's is the only one who's able to sell Big Macs, so they have their own demand for Big Macs that is a subset of that full market for burgers. What is this doing now? Well, let's start off again with the consumer. So again, back to blue. The consumer is now, maybe I need a little bit of a darker blue there. Let's try that again. The consumer is now getting this area as their consumer surplus. It's shrunk. It's now the difference between what they're willing to pay and this new P1 that they have to pay, but they only get to consume up to Q star now. What's happening to the producer? Well, from the producer perspective, again, let's go back to red. We'll go a little bit darker. From the producer's perspective, they're getting this bit. So they're getting that triangle. And then they're also getting that rectangle now, right? There we go. Let's, I'm using blue. That stroke should be a red stroke. There we go. So what we see is that difference between the price they get to sell their good for, the price they were willing to accept for their good. We see the producer surplus altogether. Producers have a little bit of a plus negative situation. They get to gain this box right there that used to be consumer surplus. They get to steal that, but they lose this triangle altogether. They lose that to the deadweight loss. Consumers lose quite a bit. They've lost this box to the producer. That's a transfer in surplus from consumers to producers. And then they lose this one here as deadweight loss. So we see in this case here where we move from a firm of perfect competition. We're all just selling the same thing. We're in a competitive equilibrium. Supply equals demand. Nobody has any market power to influence the price to deviate from that equilibrium. We are allocatively efficient. We have Pareto efficiency. Then, if we can introduce market power, one of the firms finds a way to differentiate their good. By differentiating their good, they differentiate their demand curve from the market demand curve. They then get their own marginal revenue. They then get to price accordingly, artificially restricting the amount of stuff that they make in order to push up the price. They steal some of the consumer surplus, but they generate for society this deadweight loss altogether. So what we see is that through the introduction of market power, society from this perspective is worse off. Producers win. Producer surplus rises, but consumers and society are worse off. We would be much better off in this scenario if we had the perfect competition, no differentiation of goods or services, and just taking it all at that competitive equilibrium. So I guess the big question is, if we're worse off, why is the majority of our economy, the majority of our marketplace, it is estimated upwards of 80%, if not more, of economic activity takes place underneath this? That is what we'd call our imperfect competition scenario. If we're worse off underneath imperfect competition, where we have market power, why do we allow that to happen? Well, let's just take a look at a brief example to showcase this. And to be clear, even though with this example, having market power is inefficient, it results in a loss, it results in resources being inefficiently allocated, which is not good from a societal viewpoint. But why do we allow it to happen? Let's start off just by taking a look at t-shirts. So if we start off taking a look at t-shirts, let's say that we just make just white t-shirt, same cut. Maybe it still comes in different sizes, small, medium, large, extra small, right? All the different sizes, but they're all just white. They're all just the same cut. They're all just the same material. They all just look the same. This would be efficient. This would be a case where they are entirely price takers, and you would have thousands of firms making just these one type of t-shirts. We would get to a competitive market equilibrium, supply equals demand, everything would be rosy and great. But the problem is, what if that cut doesn't work for you? What if you don't like a white shirt? It just stains too easily. Thing is we kind of want to have a little bit of variety. We want to be able to express ourselves through some of our consumption. And so we have a brand that comes out and they decide to make a blue t-shirt with a little bit of a different cut. And maybe it's different materials as well. And it's not just that they've done this, it's that you as the consumer see this as being fundamentally different than the existing. As a result, by differentiating their product, they've differentiated their demand from that market demand, and they now have obtained market power. By doing so, yes, from a surplus, from an allocatively efficient viewpoint, we are worse off. They are charging higher prices as a result. They are reducing the quantities that they produce. They are taking your consumer surplus by differentiating these goods. However, we allow this to a degree because we also value variety, or at least we believe we value variety. Keep in mind you're worse off because you value variety, but because you have this value of variety, we allow this to take place. We allow this variety into the market because we want to see different versions. However, this creates differentiated demand curves, which then creates this market failure, this loss of allocative efficiency, this inability to obtain the Pareto efficient outcome where supply equals demand, and thus society on whole is worse off. But we place some value to that variety and we say, well, you know what? Maybe economic outcomes aren't everything. Maybe there's social outcomes. Maybe there's other outcomes through this variety that we value more. And thus why we have this happen. Thus why we allow a degree of market power such that this still takes place. What I want you to keep in mind is that the more elastic this demand curve, that is, the closer, the less that they've differentiated. Maybe you're like, yeah, they're still all t-shirts, different colors. So sure, you've differentiated it, but I'm not really willing to spend that much of a different price for this shirt versus that shirt. Well, so the result of that is that the more elastic this demand curve, the less of the consumer surplus they're able to steal from you, and the smaller this deadweight loss. Meanwhile, the more they can differentiate, the more they can say our product is so different from other products like the iMac, where they're saying, hey, you come to us, you're locked into our ecosystem. There's no real substitutes if you want the aspects of our ecosystem. Then that is a more inelastic demand, a steeper demand curve. There is more of the consumer surplus being taken and a larger deadweight loss altogether. So it all depends on that degree of product differentiation, how far they can actually differentiate from the other somewhat similar products is the impact it has on our market. Okay, that was all to see the impact that market power has on our equilibrium. Well, what I want to take a look at next is going back to that starting point where we were at our equilibrium, at our competitive equilibrium, such that we had all of these 1,000 firms, each producing one unit, all happy, and they were all competing against each other. So let's backtrack to that. Okay, so here we are back in our initial situation. We have our competitive equilibrium, supply equals demand. That is, we have 1,000 small firms, each producing one unit, giving us our total market supply of 1,000 units altogether. Supply equals demand. Everybody's happy. We're good. What I want you to see is that over in this market, at this Q star, we have price. And at that point there, we have price equals average total cost. So from this profit scenario, keep in mind one way that we can express profit is our profit per unit, price minus average total cost, times our number of units that we make Q star. Well, if price is equal to average total cost, they're one and the same, we have a scenario right now where profit is 0. Okay, from here, what firms kind of want to do is they want to pursue profit. One of the ways they could do it is to push up the price. And we saw that, hey, we saw just in that previous example that you could push up the price by differentiating your good by obtaining some form of market power with that. If you can make your good different than all the other goods, you then differentiate your demand curve. You separate that average revenue price from marginal revenue. You get the higher price, you get the lower quantity. But maybe you're in a market where that's just not possible. There's really no way that you can say that your good is any different than anybody else's good. Well, the other way that you could do this is then you could just band together. You could collude with the other firms in your industry. And an example of this is what we see with OPEC, the oil producing exporting countries, and this is with oil. There's really no way to say, hey, our oil is better than someone else's oil. There's no real way to differentiate that. Oil is just oil, end of the day. I'm being a bit reductionist, but yes, oil is just oil, end of the day. And so there'd be no way to differentiate to obtain market power that way. But what you could do is you could, instead of differentiating, you could all collude, all 1,000 of you. You could collude to say, well, what if we just all acted like we were just one firm? And if we were one firm, instead of us all facing just this one point of the demand curve, we could then just witness the market demand curve as it is and treat things this way rather than trying to create our own differentiated demand curve. By colluding, what they can do is create what we can call a cartel, which is essentially trying to act like a monopoly. And by acting like a monopoly, you don't get to differentiate your oil from anybody else's, but you all come together to view the market as a whole rather than just being a price taker and taking your little segment of it. And as a result, what you can do is you can say, okay, we're going to collude, we're going to take a step back, we're going to form a committee, and we're going to evaluate what the entire market demand is. If we go and do that, well, then what happens? We can evaluate that entire market demand. Let's just change colors here again. If we evaluate that entire market demand, we can realize that we could, if we all agree to it, we could all individually choose to restrict our quantities. And if we all individually agree to restrict our quantities, we could end up at some, again, let's just change that color. Wrong one, there we go, change that color. To restrict our quantities to marginal revenue equals marginal cost, get our Q star, and then push up the price to some higher price. So essentially, this is our way that we are able to put in, I'll put that as PC, price cartel, and our Q star C, our optimal quantity under the cartel. If we're able to view the entire market through this lens, we can each decide to produce just a little bit less. If we each decide to produce just a little bit less, we get this higher price. And as a result, we get to be better off. How does this look for the individual firm? Well, the way that that looks for the individual firm is they each agree to produce a little bit less and earn this higher price. So what's the result of that? Well, we restrict our quantities just a little bit, and we end up such that we get now, from the firm's perspective, this new price. And then what's our cost? Well, cost is off of this new Q star. Sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's write this. This would be our Q star cartel. Q star cartel up to our average total cost curve. That would be our new blue average total cost. Hey, take a look at this. Profit is price minus average total cost times Q star. Initially, we were earning zero profit. Now, we're earning P minus average total cost, so we're earning that amount per unit sold all over Q star C. So that is our profit in this scenario. Let's use this blue to denote profit. Our total profit is going to be that square. Let's just maybe put some transparency on that. There we go. So that is our total profit that we could earn as each of these individual firms if we were to join this cartel. I don't know about you, but I'm pretty sure that this positive profit looks a lot better than the zero profit that we were earning originally. So the firms are incentivized, they're enticed to join this cartel because they can be better off. But now here's where it starts to fall apart. Here's where it starts to fall apart. They are winning, they're getting this positive profit, But each of them, they've just come together as a bunch of individual firms. They haven't actually merged their balance sheets. They haven't actually created a new board of directors. They haven't actually merged their companies to become a monopoly. This is just 1,000 firms that has come together to pretend to be a monopoly, to act like a monopoly. But each of them is still its own independent profit maximizing firm. And that's important because they all came together, they all restricted their output and causing them to push up the price to price cartel. They now each individually on their own, let's use yellow, witness price equals marginal revenue is the new market price. Well, hey, because each 1,000 of these firms are profit maximizing individual firms, they're looking at this and going, okay, I can restrict my output to the cartel level of output and earn that box as my positive profit. Or, hear me out, I could go profit maximizing condition, marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Where does that give us? Well, let's go take a look. Let's use yellow again. Marginal revenue equals marginal cost. I could jump my quantity a little bit higher. Let's call this our Q star cheat because we're cheating on the cartel arrangement. If I'm at Q star cheat, okay, I'm making more units at the same price, so that's going to be good. But also, what happens to my average total cost? Well, again, average total cost would be Q star to average total cost curve. Our average total cost is now lower. We now get this new lower average total cost in this scenario. So what is our profit? Well, our new profit, let's just use some shade of yellow for this new profit. We are going to be making price minus average total cost. So that vertical distance is our profit per unit all over Q star cheat units. Look at that. If I cheat on this cartel arrangement, I am getting even larger positive profits. So purely as a self-interested firm, what should I do? Should I stay in this cartel arrangement or should I cheat and make even larger profits? Well, again, if I'm entirely just self-interested, cheating and getting these even larger profits looks like an awesome opportunity. And so I have every incentive to cheat, to deviate from this cartel arrangement and increase the amount of quantity that I'm producing. Okay, here's the rub. If only one out of these 1,000 firms does it, no one ever knows. Because each of these firms is so small, producing only one out of those 1,000, that if the one firm goes to Q star cheat, the impact would be so tiny to the amount of quantity in the market that we'd be really still at price cartel. So there's no real issue there. Where the issue comes is each of these firms has the incentive to cheat. Each of these firms knows that if they're the only one, they're not going to get caught. They can get away with earning positive profit and massive amounts of positive profit. So they all want to do it. As they all want to do it, they all rush to increase, their quantity. All 1,000 do it, which then increases the total market supply, which then higher quantity supplied just gives us back to the equilibrium price. And that is back to zero profit. So what we tend to witness with cartels is exactly this kind of circular impact. They get together, they collude, they're able to collude for a period of time, earning this blue positive profit, but then eventually they have such a strong incentive to cheat by earning even larger profit that each firm eventually starts to cheat and obtain this higher profit. As more and more and more of the firms do it, the total quantity supplied to the marketplace begins to increase, and we collapse from this market power kind of outcome back to our competitive equilibrium and back to this zero profit. And that's kind of our ultimately, this is our prisoner's dilemma if we wanted to model it with a matrix, just being expressed in this kind of storytelling, looking at the graph kind of way. That being said, there have been successful cartels. We have many cases, not just with OPEC. I mean, OPEC tends to create their cartel, push up the price, each member cheats, they overflood the market with oil, the price of oil collapses back down to zero profit. They come back together, they restrict, push up the price, getting the profit, they cheat, get even more profit, collapses back down. Okay, that's the OPEC story. That's why it keeps going around in the news every time OPEC relaunches some new restrictions. In Canada, we've seen cartels form around high density foam. We've seen them form around bread. We've seen them form around frozen potato products. All of these situations where they are essentially perfectly competitive, no ability to deviate their price, but they get together to act as a cartel, act as a monopoly, to view the entire curve, restrict their output, push up the price, and earn even larger profit. Some of these Canadian cartels have been very successful. Some of these Canadian cartels have broken that mold of, hey, we push up to positive profit. As we push up to positive profit, oh no, we have the incentive to cheat. Everybody cheats, we fall apart. How have they done it? That's the question. How do you run a successful cartel? Well, to run a successful cartel, there's two things you need. The first thing you need is you need a way to control your members. You need a way to control your members so that when you come together, when you collude, yes, you restrict your output to Q star cartel. But then you need a way to keep an eye on this, to see what is happening, to make sure that they're not cheating, they're not flooding the market. Some cases that have worked really well with this is in Canada, we have our dairy industry. Now, to be able to produce dairy, so cheese, milk, and the rest, you need to be certified by the Dairy Board. The Dairy Board tells you how many liters of dairy you are allowed to produce and thus sell to them to then resell to the Canadian market. If you produce more liters of dairy than you're permitted to, they dump it. And if you look through the news, there's plenty of stories of dairy farmers in outrage, all mad that the Dairy Board has come and dumped thousands of liters of dairy. Why have they done it? Because essentially that dairy farmer was overproducing, was at the Q star cheat. And the Dairy Board, wanting to maintain their cartel pricing, said, no, 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 we are restricting you to this restricted quantity to maintain a high price and maintain just this cartel level of profit. So, Canadian Dairy Board, one example of a very successful cartel that's been able to control their members. Another case would be the taxi industry. The taxi industry, again, because of the legal rules with it, you can only drive for so many hours per day. So, okay, you can't drive extra hours per day, otherwise you're too tired, you're in violation of the law, that's big problems. So no one taxi provider can oversupply trips. So just based off of that legislative requirement, it's pretty easy to keep the number of trips provided by the taxi industry restricted at your Q star cartel, thus pushing up the price and earning this cartel level of profit. You can't provide significantly extra trips, so you can't cheat, you can't oversupply, thus the cartel arrangement is maintained. There's a second condition that needs to be met though. You need to be able to restrict entry. You need to be able to restrict entry. And the reason you need to be able to restrict entry is because if this is, let's just scroll up, if this is a competitive equilibrium, firms are free to come into this market. They're free to leave this market. And what is a great sign to come into a new market? All the firms in that market earning a very healthy positive profit. So if you are earning this positive cartel profit, you are telling firms, come into this market, come and enter this. What does that do? Well, that begins to increase the number of firms in the market from 1,000 to 1,001. Well, maybe that's not that big of a deal, but they keep coming in. They keep coming in. They keep coming in. Suddenly, we have 2,000 firms in this market. What does that do altogether? Well, in the view of this, if you can't capture them, if you can't bring them into your cartel, having all of these firms enter that market has the effect of pushing our supply to the right. That is essentially very similar as to our case of with we just flooding the market with extra production. So all of these new entrants, this profit attracts entry. All of that new entry is new firms pushing that supply to the right, which is pushing down the price that we can charge back to this zero profit where there'd no longer be any incentive to enter, right? You don't want to enter a market earning zero profit. So we would have this incentive to enter, pushing down prices until we get to zero profit. How does the dairy industry, how does the taxi industry deal with this? Well, quite easily. The dairy industry restricts entry. They just say, hey, in order to be part of our dairy board, we're only going to give up so many licenses, so many memberships to be part of the dairy industry. Now, if you want to become a new dairy farmer, you need to be inspected, you need to pay your fees, your dues, and we need to approve you to be able to produce dairy here in Canada. For the most part, as dairy farmers retire, new ones can come in and you can start producing dairy. How does the taxi industry do it? Well, the taxi industry does that by offering their taxi medallions. You can only be a taxi driver, you can only provide taxi services if you have a taxi license or a taxi medallion. You might be earning huge positive profits in this industry, but you can't come in because legislatively you are being restricted by the taxi industry, by the dairy board, saying no new entrants are allowed. So they're able to control their existing membership and they're able to restrict entry for new membership, thus maintaining these large positive profits altogether. If you can't do one or both of these, ultimately your cartel will fail. It'll either fail by your existing members cheating, or it'll fail by that positive profit attracting new entrants to the market, flooding the market with new goods, and again, pushing you down to that competitive equilibrium through that way. So you have to have either the ability to control or the ability to put up barriers in order to prevent that from happening. Okay, in this video, we introduced the surplus. We've taken a look at consumer surplus, producer surplus. We've taken a look at how that changes with market power. We've taken a look at this idea of a cartel, how a cartel could act like a monopoly to have this facade of market power. And we've seen why cartels are inherently unstable unless they can control their members or restrict entry. I want to switch gears now. I want to take a look at the last part that I said, which would be for this video, which is the notion of comparative statics. Let's go see what exactly that's all about. Okay, so what we have here is our supply and our demand diagram in its initial equilibrium. Supply equal demand, so we get our market clearing price P naught and our quantity exchange Q naught. What I then have listed is all of our determinants of demand and all of our determinants of supply. What inevitably happens is we have some shock to our system. Something in the world changes, and as that changes, we need to analyze how that affects our supply and demand, how that affects our competitive market. And I want to be clear here, we're looking at competitive markets. That's why we have a supply curve and not just the marginal cost of the individual firm. It's why we have P and Q at equilibrium and not P based off of the feasibility set and Q from where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. We have a competitive market, a competitive equilibrium in this case, where our firms are price takers. Okay, with that assumption clear and out of the way, what we have is shocks. Things happen, and as things happen, it ends up influencing that equilibrium P and Q. And let's go and take a look at a few of these. We're not going to go through very many, but a few of them and see what that impact is. And let's start off. Let's say that this is the market for rents. So for shelter rents, 1-bedroom rentals. Okay, so if we have the market for 1-bedroom rentals, and all of a sudden in the greater Victoria area, the population increases. So population goes up, and now anytime we do a shock like this, anytime we have one of these happen, we're doing this ceteris paribus. That's Latin, that's just fancy for saying we're doing this all else held constant. So in this case, I'm saying, hey, we have a change in the population, but that's a change in the population assuming a constant season, a constant taste preference expectation, constant income, constant price of everything else, constant price of rents, constant price to supply rents, constant prices of, again, everything else in this scenario is fixed. The only thing that's changing is the population. So what does this do? Well, if the population is increasing, that is, we have more individual demand curves that we are adding up. If we have more individual demand curves that we are adding up, that is, our demand curve has shifted to the right. There we go. If our demand curve has shifted to the right, this existing demand curve ceases to truthfully exist. So we'll kind of just change its transparency to be a bit dimmer there. So we can still reference where it was, but recognize it's not there anymore. The result of this is what used to be the original market clearing price. And at this, the original quantity exchanged is now just our quantity supply. So it used to be QS equals QD, but that quantity demanded, that demand curve's no longer there. So it's now just our quantity supply. Then, at this current price, take that across, we have our new quantity demanded. So there's our new quantity demanded. The result of this is that at the current price, we have excess demand. What I want you to see is that the way we go through this shock is we put through the shock in 2 to 6 or 2 to 6, and what that results in is a disequilibrium situation, such that this change in population caused our quantity demanded to increase for a fixed price level. Thus, it caused our demand to increase. We then end up in a disequilibrium. In order to correct for this disequilibrium, we need to allow a change. Let's go blue. A change in own price. Oh, I wanted a lot more transparency than that. Let's blue with transparency. There we go. We're now allowing a change in own price to happen. And we're now doing this for the new population. So we're allowing change in own price, all else fixed. So, okay, what's happening? We have our story. We have excess demand. We only have maybe 100 one-bedrooms available for rent, but people want to rent 150. So what ends up happening? In order to get these units that they want to live in, they begin to offer, they begin to bid higher rents. They say, hey, if you give it to me, I will give you this higher price so that I can be sure that I have a place to live. The landlords, the supplier of one-bedroom units, they're not going to pass that up. So they're going to say, sure, I'll accept that new higher price. Similarly, what happens is some people start to see this higher price that is being offered, and they go, wow, people are able to rent out one bedroom for that price. I have a bedroom that's just sitting empty. Maybe I'm now willing to supply this extra one bedroom to the market at this higher price. So demanders push up, demanders start to bid the price up, suppliers respond, taking advantage of that economic rent, and this whole process continues until we arrive at some new higher P1 price for rent. And the resulting impact is that we get our new quantity exchanged. Our new quantity exchanged all together. So higher prices, more rooms altogether available for rent. But how does it look as we went through our entire process? Well, through the entire process, if we were to focus on the excess demand side, population surged, quantity of rents, quantity of one bedrooms that we wanted went up. Then prices began to climb. As prices began to climb, our quantity demanded began to fall because some people go, wow, I can't afford a one bedroom at that rate. I can't afford to live here anymore. I'm either going to start to double up with a roommate or I'm going to leave altogether. As a result of that, our quantity demanded is falling due to the rising prices, and we're moving along that demand curve until we arrive at that new equilibrium, such that the final overall effect is higher prices of rent and more quantities in it being exchanged altogether. And that is how we'd work through our comparative statics. We have a shock, we work through which curve is affected. This creates a disequilibrium. That disequilibrium then gets corrected through change in own price. That change in own price is then a movement along the demand, along the supply, and we arrive at the new equilibrium such that we have our overall effect, change in P, change in Q. Well, let's take a look at another example. Let's take a look at a supply side case. Okay, in this case, let's suppose that we have a big increase in our wages. So maybe a bunch of unions have gone on strike and they have successfully negotiated for higher wages. People often take this and say, okay, hey, higher wages, that's a change in income. Yeah, technically it is. But what we want to keep in mind is that this isn't everybody's wages that has gone up across. It is just those members of the union altogether. And so what has happened is really it's just the wages that have gone up. Typically, what we're referring to when we say this is in the sector we're talking about. So let's not talk about rents anymore. Let's talk about something else. Let's say this is the market for vehicles. That's a lot of letters to write. Let's say the market for cars. There we go. And it is the auto sector wages that were pushed up. So the wages of the people who make cars. Essentially, Unifor successfully negotiated higher wages. Yet, some of the people working for Unifor are, with higher wages, having higher income, but most of the people buying cars on the demand side are not also employees of the car manufacturer. So primarily, this increase in the auto wages is primarily affecting a change in the input price, such that cars are now more expensive to make. If cars are now more expensive to make, all else constant, at a fixed price level, we're not able to make as many cars as we once were. So we're now stuck there. That is, we have our new, carry that down, our new quantity supplied. This supply curve then, what does that mean? It means it has shifted. Oh, I don't want that one. Let's try that again. Our supply curve has shifted. Let's get it through that dot. There we go. Our supply curve has shifted to the left. we have had this decrease in supply. Let's change that guy there. What's going on? There we go. That supply curve has shifted to the left. Again, that means that this existing supply curve, let's drop the transparency on that, is kind of no longer there. We now have our new one. What used to be our equilibrium quantity exchanged at that market clearing price is now just our quantity demanded. So again, in two scenarios I've looked through now, we have excess demand as a result of this. Now we've worked through the impact of this shock. We are done. That is the change in input price. We are stuck in a disequilibrium. Okay, we're not done. We can't stay in a disequilibrium. Market forces are going to start to take hold. As these market forces start to take hold, we start to witness a change in own price for all of these guys being fixed. And so the result of that is less cars are being produced than used to be produced. We still want the same amount of cars at this price. So in order to make sure that we get the car that we want, we begin to bid up the price. We begin to say, hey, I will pay more to get that car because I really need or want a car. The firm goes, oh, wow, you're actually willing to pay more for it? Thus, the firm increase their price as a result, and altogether at the higher price, they're willing to produce more vehicles. However, at this higher price, while they're producing more vehicles, the consumer, the demander, you and I go, you know what? I don't actually want that many more. And we converge on the new equilibrium such that altogether we arrive at the new quantity exchanged. Let's be a little bit more. There we go. And the new market clearing price. Altogether, what is the impact of this? Well, in this case here, the impact of that supply shock would be a higher price, and versus where we started from, a lower quantity being exchanged altogether. So the effect of these auto sector wages rising is a higher price of vehicles and fewer vehicles being bought or sold. What you can ultimately do is work through any of these changes for a competitive market and say, okay, if we have a change in taste, preferences, or expectations, we have a change in seasons, we have a change in technology, we have a change in the price of an intermediate and input good, what does that do to our final price of our good and the quantity exchanged? And we go through these comparative statics. We change the curve itself for a fixed price level. This creates some sort of disequilibrium. We then respond to that disequilibrium through either excess supply or excess demand, causing a change in own price, navigating back to our equilibrium, market clearing price, and quantity exchanged. Okay, that covers off for this video. We've covered surplus, surplus under the competitive equilibrium, surplus with market power, surplus with this idea of allocative efficiency. That is allocative efficiency. We're allocating the right resources to the right place to maximize our surplus when we are at that competitive equilibrium. And we've also taken a look at that being at that competitive equilibrium is our Pareto efficient outcome. Any deviation from that, sure, one may be better off, but overall we're worse off. So any deviation from the equilibrium is technically a Pareto inefficient outcome altogether. We took a look underneath that surplus, surplus underneath market power, and the special case of market power, which was cartels. And of course, we could have done the surplus under cartels as well. However, it would have just been the exact same as surplus under market power. There's nothing really special or different in that. If you have any questions from this video, as always, please feel free to reach out. Either drop a comment below or send me an email. Thanks. Until next time.